Welcome back to Tanya in 5. The last few days we have been studying chapter 6 of part 3 of Tanya, Iggeret HaTeshuva. In chapter 5, the Alter Rebbe explained the nature of sin. The divine soul is attached to the loftiest levels of the divine. And from there is a direct line that connects that lofty level to the soul as it's invested in the body. And sin causes a obstruction in that flow from the divine lofty source of the soul into the soul that's in the body. And some sins are so great as to cause a complete obstruction. And thus, in temple times, one would die as a result of that sin, because the flow of energy has been obstructed. Now, the Alter Rebbe is going to explain why it is that nowadays, post the era of the temple, there are those who can do such grave sins and yet continue to live happy and prosperous lives. And in explaining this, we learn about a new element of sin. Namely, during temple times, the divine energy that would flow into our world to energize it was in a perfectly symmetrical fashion. That is to say, the divine energy flows from one spiritual rung to a lower spiritual rung, and from that lower spiritual rung to another lower spiritual rung, and so on and so forth, until it finally made it into the temple that stood in Jerusalem, and from there to the rest of the world. So it was a perfectly stacked hierarchy of spiritual levels, one linked to the one above it, in a perfectly organized fashion, in that each level was invested in the level below it in a willful and proper fashion. And this is true especially of the Jew. Now, under such circumstances, when one does something, a sin, that is in opposition to the desire of that life force, that flow of energy, that would cut off the flow of energy, and thus he would die. But once the temple has been destroyed, the divine energy in our world is now in what the Zohar terms exile. Exile means that one is in service of something that is opposite to them. Literally, if someone's exiled from their land, one is in servitude to another country that they no longer wish to be. And the same thing is true of the exile of the divine energy as it's invested in our world. The divine energy invested in our world to give it life and to energize it in the post-temple era is such that it is embedded in the natural order of our world in such a fashion that the world itself could live not necessarily in perfect alignment with the desire of the divine energy that keeps it going. That's the nature of exile. So the divine energy is no longer flowing through the temple, but it's in exile scattered all over the place, and thus embedded in all kinds of systems that don't necessarily operate in perfect alignment with its desire. And thus, a Jew can do a sin and live a happy, prosperous life. Moreover, because the Jew still retains its attachment to the lofty divine source, when this Jew chooses to do a sin, the sin itself rejoices. Because look, here we have a Jew who's got a direct line to the highest and loftiest source of divine energy, and here now it's serving us the sin. The sin is so excited that the Jew who does sin may actually live an even more prosperous life. Because the negative spiritual energy of sin, of Klippa, is very happy to have this new host, this Jew who has a link and an attachment to the highest of loftiest spiritual sources, the divine energy on the deepest level. So the takeaway from all of this is, on the one hand, it's true, as we said in chapter 4, on one level, there is a cut. When a person does a sin, there's a certain cut-off between the soul and his body and its divine source. But once the temple has been destroyed, there's a whole other element to sin, which is that we now have the choice to take the divine energy that remains with us on some level. We can take it with us into the lowest and worst of places, into sin itself. And thus, our choice between mitzvahs and sins is not a question of, do you want a happy, good life, do mitzvahs? Do you want a stressful life, do sin? That may have been true in the temple times. But now, a person can do sin and live a happy, prosperous, material life. But deep down, he's going to feel the exile of his soul. He's going to feel his soul empty and laying waste, knowing that it's living a life that is not true to it. Or a person can choose the life of mitzvahs, the life of attachment to God, in which he may not be as physically or materialistically prosperous, but he's going to feel the true fulfillment of his divine soul, and that brings a joy like no other. Looking forward to seeing you when we conclude chapter 7.